Sarah stood by the window, her eyes tracing the lines of the garden she had cultivated over the years. The roses, which once bloomed with vibrant red petals, now looked faded and tired, much like she felt inside. She was 62 years old, and life had passed her by in ways that were both subtle and profound. When she had been younger, she had always prided herself on being a woman who was in control, a woman who knew what she wanted and, more importantly, knew how to get it. And she had achieved a great deal, more than most people could say. She had climbed to the top of her profession, becoming a respected lawyer in a field dominated by men, and had built a comfortable life for herself and her family. But somewhere along the way, she had lost something far more important: herself. It wasn't as if she had been unaware of the sacrifices she made along the way. She had always known that her career came first. When she was younger, there had been so many late nights at the office, so many weekends spent preparing for the next big case, that she had lost track of the time she was supposed to be spending with her children. And her husband, well, he was a patient man, but there were only so many times he could forgive her absence. Eventually, he had stopped asking her to dinner, stopped waiting for her to come home early enough to help with the kids. He had always understood that her work was important, but as the years passed, he became a quiet, distant figure in their household. It wasn't until after his death that Sarah realized how much of her life had been consumed by her ambition, how much of her own life and the lives of the people she loved most had been sacrificed on the altar of success. And now, years later, those realizations came crashing down on her in waves that were harder to ignore. Sarah's children were grown now, both living on their own in different parts of the country. They had their own families, their own lives. And Sarah, for the first time, truly understood the loneliness that had crept into her life over the years. She had given so much of herself to her career that she had never truly been present for her children or for her husband in the way they had needed her. In the quiet of her home, she would find herself reflecting on the years that had passed, wondering what might have been different if she had prioritized family over work. She would think about the missed birthdays, the family vacation she had skipped, the weekend she had spent locked away in her office while her children played outside, waiting for her to join them. The regret was suffocating, and it was getting harder to push it aside. Sarah had never been one for self-pity. She was strong, resilient, and had always believed in taking responsibility for her actions. But the weight of the choices she had made in her earlier years was starting to feel unbearable. How had she allowed herself to become so consumed with success that she didn't even notice the time slipping away? How had she convinced herself that being absent was justifiable because of the work she was doing? She had always told herself that she was doing it for them, providing for her family, ensuring their financial security, giving them a comfortable life. But was that really the truth? Or had it all been a way for her to avoid facing the discomfort of intimacy, of vulnerability? She had spent her whole life building walls around her heart, focusing on her career, focusing on external accomplishments as a way of keeping people at a distance. And now, in the silence of her later years, those walls felt like a prison. There were mornings when she woke up with a tightness in her chest, a deep, gnawing emptiness that seemed to follow her throughout the day. She would go about her routines, making coffee, reading the newspaper, taking a walk through the neighborhood, but none of it ever seemed to fill the void that was growing inside her. Her friends, many of whom were also in their 60s, would talk about their grandchildren, their travels, their hobbies, but Sarah found herself unable to join in. She had nothing to contribute. Her life, it seemed, had been dedicated to something that no longer held any meaning for her. Her work was gone, her children were distant, and her husband was gone forever. All that was left was a woman in the twilight of her years, struggling to reconcile the person she had become with the person she had once hoped to be. It wasn't as if she hadn't tried to reach out to her children. She had failed them, and there was nothing she could do to change that. The loss of her husband was another wound she had never fully processed. He had been patient with her, understanding when she had to stay late at work, and never once complained about her absence. But he had needed her, too. In the years before his death, he had become more withdrawn, more distant, as if he had resigned himself to the fact that Sarah would never be there in the way he needed her to be. And then, after he was gone, Sarah had been left alone with her regrets, with her overwhelming sense of loss. She had attended his funeral, said the right words, and carried on with her life, but deep down, she knew that she hadn't been the wife he deserved. She had made phone calls, sent messages, tried to arrange visits, but something had shifted. They were polite but distant, and Sarah couldn't help but feel that they resented her for the years she had been absent. They had built their own lives, their own families, and in some ways, she felt like a stranger to them. Every time she picked up the phone to call her son or daughter, she hesitated, not knowing what to say. The years of neglect couldn't be undone with a few words or a late apology. They were grown adults now, and they had long since moved on from the family dynamics that Sarah had once dictated. The guilt crept in, wrapping itself around her like a heavy cloak. In the quiet moments of reflection, she would find herself wishing she could turn back time, wishing she could have been the partner he had always needed, instead of the career-driven woman who had often chosen work over love. Sarah's guilt wasn't something she could talk about easily. She had always prided herself on her independence, her strength. She was the one who fixed problems, who handled things with grace. But this was different. How could she forgive herself for what she had done? How could she let go of the regret that seemed to define her every thought? She had spent her entire life chasing external success. But now, as she stood at the threshold of her senior years, she realized that the only thing that truly mattered was the relationships she had neglected, the people she had failed to be present for. But it was too late to turn back the clock. The damage had been done, and no amount of success could undo the years that had been lost. As she sat in her chair, staring out at the fading roses in the garden, Sarah felt the weight of all those years bearing down on her. The regrets were unbearable, yet they were a part of her now. She had built a life that was full of accomplishments, but none of it had brought her the happiness she had imagined. She had lost the people she loved most, and in doing so, had lost herself. And so, Sarah found herself facing a difficult truth. She had to learn how to forgive herself for the mistakes of the past, no matter how hard it was. Because if she didn't, she would spend the rest of her life carrying this burden, a burden that would prevent her from finding peace in the years that remained. But how could she do that? How could she forgive herself when the weight of her decisions felt so overwhelming? The journey ahead seemed long and uncertain, but was the only path left to walk. And so, as Sarah continued to look out over her garden, she made a silent promise to herself. She would try. She would try to forgive herself, even if it was the hardest thing she had ever done. Because, in the end, it was the only way she could find any measure of peace. The weight of Sarah's thoughts continued to press on her, especially in the quiet hours when the house was still and the world outside seemed far away. The garden, once full of life and color, had become a symbol of everything that had faded in her life. The roses that had once bloomed so vividly now looked tired and worn, much like her spirit. Sarah could no longer ignore the reality of her past, nor could she escape the fact that, in a way, she had built a life that was outwardly successful but inwardly hollow. She had focused so intensely on what she thought mattered at the time, career, status, financial security, that she had missed the things that truly did, her family, her relationships, and her own happiness. The shift had been gradual, almost imperceptible at first. As a young woman, Sarah had been consumed with the ambition to make a name for herself. Her dream had always been to break barriers, to show the world that a woman could succeed in a field dominated by men. She had pushed herself relentlessly through law school, through long nights of studying and exams, always striving for excellence. When she finally landed her first big job at a prestigious law firm, it was everything she had hoped for. She felt proud, accomplished, and ready to conquer the world. But as the years went by, she found herself pouring more and more of her energy into her work, always pushing for the next promotion, the next big case, the next milestone. Her husband, David, had been supportive at first. He admired her drive, her ambition, and he respected the fact that she was chasing her dreams. But somewhere along the way, Sarah's success had started to take a toll on their relationship. It wasn't immediate. In the beginning, David would come home from his own work, and they would share stories about their days, make dinner together, and find time to laugh. But slowly, the dinners became more infrequent. The trips they had once taken together, the vacations to places they had dreamed of visiting, became a distant memory as Sarah's workload increased and David's patience began to wear thin. He never complained. Instead, he began to retreat into himself, spending more time in the garden or reading in his study. Sarah didn't notice at first. She was too busy with cases, meetings, and deadlines to see the growing distance between them. One day, when Sarah came home late from the office, David was sitting in his favorite chair by the window, staring out at the garden. She could tell by the way he was sitting that something was different, something was wrong, but she couldn't pinpoint what it was. He had always been a quiet man, content with the simple things in life. But in that moment, there was an air of resignation about him that she hadn't seen before. He didn't greet her the way he usually did, didn't offer his usual smile. Instead, he simply looked at her with a tired, weary gaze. "David?" she asked, setting her briefcase down and stepping closer. "Is everything okay?" He sighed deeply, a sound that seemed to come from the very core of him. "Sarah, we need to talk," he said quietly, his voice tinged with a sadness that Sarah couldn't quite understand. She stood there for a moment, frozen, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't like them to have serious talks like this. Their relationship, although it had its rough patches, had always been built on the assumption that they would figure things out together. But now, in this moment, there was an undeniable weight between them that neither of them could ignore any longer. "Sarah, I've been patient with you. I understand how important your work is, but I can't keep living like this. I can't keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not. You're not here. You're not present in this family. You're here physically, but you're not really here. And I don't know how much longer I can take it." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. She had heard them, but they didn't quite register at first. It wasn't until she saw the sadness in his eyes, the hurt that had been buried beneath his calm exterior for so long, that she realized just how much damage had been done. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice shaky. I thought I was doing this for us. For our future. I thought you understood." "I do," he replied, his voice soft but firm. "But I need you, Sarah. I need you to be here, to be with me, to be with our family. I need you to show up in the way that matters. And I can't keep waiting." She didn't know what to say. The truth of his words was undeniable, but it was also painful. She had been so focused on her career, so consumed by the idea of success, that she had failed to see how her absence was affecting the people she loved most. She had convinced herself that she was doing the right thing, that the sacrifices were necessary, that the long hours and missed family moments were just part of the process. But now, standing in front of David, she realized that all those justifications had been empty. What good was success if she had nothing to show for it except an empty house and a husband who was slowly slipping away from her? But it wasn't just David who had been affected. It was her children, too. As Sarah sat in the quiet of her home, the realization hit her like a wave. Her son, Michael, had grown up in a home where his mother was always too busy for him. She had missed his school plays, his soccer games, the little moments that children long to share with their parents. And her daughter, Emily, had been no different. Sarah had promised herself that she would be there for them, that she would balance her work with being a good mother, but she had failed. She had sacrificed her time with them for meetings and deadlines, convinced herself that as long as she provided for them financially, everything else would fall into place. But now, looking back, she realized how wrong she had been. Her children were adults now, with their own families and their own lives. The bond she had once shared with them felt frayed, distant, as if time had eroded it beyond repair. It wasn't just the missed moments. It was the emotional distance that had grown between them over the years. She had tried to reconnect with them after David's passing, sending messages, calling, trying to arrange visits, but it never felt the same. They were polite, of course, but there was a hesitance in their voices, a guardedness that Sarah couldn't ignore. They didn't resent her, but they didn't need her the way they once had. The realization that her children had grown up without her active involvement in their lives, was a bitter pill to swallow. As Sarah sat in her chair that evening, a deep sense of regret began to settle over her. She had spent so many years chasing something that, in the end, hadn't brought her the fulfillment she thought it would. Her career had been important, yes, but at what cost? She had sacrificed relationships, love, and the moments that truly mattered for the pursuit of something that felt increasingly empty. She couldn't go back and undo the years she had spent in the office instead of with her children or her husband. She couldn't rewrite the past, but she could, perhaps, learn to forgive herself. It was a sobering thought, one that Sarah wasn't ready to accept fully, but it was a thought that began to shape her future. She didn't know yet how to heal the wounds she had caused, or if they could ever be healed at all. But what she did know was that if she was ever going to find peace, if she was ever going to move forward with her life, she needed to stop looking back. She needed to stop blaming herself for the choices she had made and start finding a way to live with them, to make amends where possible, and to begin building new relationships, this time with the people who truly mattered. As she stared out at the fading roses in her garden, Sarah realized that forgiveness, true forgiveness, would have to start with herself. Only then could she begin to rebuild the life she had neglected for so long. Only then could she stop carrying the weight of her past and start living fully in the present. It wouldn't be easy and it wouldn't be quick, but it was the only way forward. And so, in the stillness of that evening, Sarah made a promise to herself. She would try to forgive herself for the choices she had made, and in doing so, she would find a way to heal the wounds she had carried for so long. It was the only way she could begin to let go of the past and move toward a future filled with the love and connection she had always longed for. The struggle to forgive herself began long before Sarah could even put it into words. For weeks after her realization, she found herself trapped in a cycle of regret, guilt, and disbelief. It was one thing to acknowledge the pain of her past choices. It was another entirely to know how to move forward. The idea of forgiving herself, truly accepting her mistakes, and letting go of the burden of guilt felt insurmountable. It wasn't something she could simply think away. It wasn't a matter of saying a few words and expecting to feel better. The weight of her actions, the years she had spent absent from the lives of those she loved, felt like a heavy cloak she couldn't shed. Sarah began to spend more time in the garden, the only place that seemed to offer any solace. She would sit there for hours, her mind racing through the memories of what she had lost. Those quiet dinners with David, the birthdays and school recitals she had missed, the moments of laughter and joy that had passed her by. She found herself retracing the steps she had taken, trying to understand where things had gone wrong and why she hadn't seen it sooner. But the more she thought about it, the more she became trapped in a cycle of self-blame. She couldn't escape the constant loop of what-ifs that circled around her thoughts. What if she had taken more time for her family? What if she had left work earlier? What if she had truly listened to David when he tried to tell her how much he needed her? The questions never stopped, and each one only deepened her sense of regret. Every attempt she made to move forward felt like pushing a boulder up a steep hill. It wasn't just the past that haunted her, it was the present. Her relationships with her children were strained, distant. Sarah had tried to call them more, tried to fill the empty spaces with conversations, but the walls between them remained. Her son, Michael, was polite but distant. He had his own family now, his own life. The conversations were brief, and there were long silences between them. She could sense the unease in his voice, the distance in the way he spoke to her. He had grown up without her, after all, and it wasn't something that could be easily fixed. It wasn't something that could be solved with a few phone calls or quick visits. Her daughter, Emily, was no different. Emily had been a more sensitive one when she was younger, the one who had always yearned for Sarah's attention. But as the years went on, she had stopped asking for it. The visits had become fewer, the calls even less frequent. Emily was married now, living in a different city, and Sarah's presence in her life had become almost non-existent. Emily had her own family, her own life, and Sarah could feel the invisible distance between them, even though her daughter was always polite and never showed overt signs of resentment. Sarah had tried to bridge the gap, to reach out more often, but something about the distance between them felt permanent, like an unspoken truth that neither of them could address. She knew they weren't angry with her. They weren't children anymore, and they had their own lives to live. But Sarah couldn't escape the feeling that they resented her absence. And the more she tried to reconnect with them, the more she realized how much time had passed and how difficult it was to rebuild what had been lost. In the quiet of her home, Sarah would sometimes cry, the tears coming unexpectedly as she faced the enormity of what she had lost. She hadn't just lost time with her children or with David. She had lost a part of herself. In her pursuit of success, she had buried parts of her heart. She had convinced herself that work was all that mattered, that providing for her family, being successful, was the ultimate form of love. But now, she saw how misguided that had been. She had neglected the very things that made life meaningful. She had taken her relationships for granted, thinking they would always be there. But now, they felt like fragile threads, fraying and unraveling before her eyes. Despite her overwhelming feelings of guilt and shame, Sarah knew that she had to try something different. She couldn't keep going on like this, stuck in the past, regretting her choices without ever moving forward. She needed to find a way to make peace with herself, to learn how to forgive herself. But the path forward seemed unclear, and the journey felt impossibly difficult. Her therapist, Dr. Elizabeth, had been the first to suggest that Sarah might need to explore self-forgiveness. Sarah had been skeptical at first. She had always prided herself on being self-sufficient, on solving her own problems. She wasn't the type of person who relied on others for guidance, and the idea of going through a therapeutic process felt alien to her. But as time went on, she found herself thinking more about Dr. Elizabeth's words. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, the therapist had said. It's about acknowledging what you've done, understanding why it happened, and then releasing yourself from the burden of guilt. You can't change the past, but you can change how you carry it with you moving forward. Those words had stuck with Sarah, and over time, they began to make sense. She couldn't undo her past mistakes. No amount of wishing, no amount of regret, would bring back the years she had lost. But she could choose how she carried them. She could choose to learn from them and, in time, let them go. And so, Sarah began the slow and painful process of healing. She started with small steps, trying to release the grip that guilt had on her heart. It wasn't easy. Some days felt like a struggle just to get out of bed and face the world. The weight of her regret was heavy, and the sense of loss almost suffocating. But she pushed herself to keep going, to do the things that felt hard but were necessary for her healing. One of the first things Sarah did was reconnect with her children in a more honest way. She stopped pretending that everything was fine. She stopped trying to mask the pain with pleasantries and superficial conversations. She told them, in simple terms, how much she regretted not being there for them. She told them how deeply sorry she was for the years she had missed, and for the mistakes she had made. She didn't expect them to forgive her immediately. She didn't even know if they ever would. But it was a start. It was her way of acknowledging the damage and beginning this slow process of rebuilding trust. Michael, her son, had been quiet during their conversation, but Sarah noticed the softening in his voice. "Mom, I know you did what you thought was best," he said, his words gentle but firm. "But it doesn't change the fact that you weren't there. I'm not angry with you. I don't know how to move past it." His words stung, but they also gave her something to hold on to, a glimmer of hope. Emily, too, had listened, and although she had tears in her eyes, she didn't say much. She had always been more reserved, but Sarah could see the walls around her heart softening, just a little. It was a small step, but it was something. In the weeks that followed, Sarah continued to reach out, making an effort to visit her children and to spend more time with them, even if it was just over the phone or via video call. It wasn't easy. It didn't feel natural at first. But as time went on, those moments became more comfortable. The distance between them began to shrink, little by little, and Sarah realized that while she couldn't undo the past, she could build a future with them, one step at a time. But the hardest part of all was learning to forgive herself. In many ways, that was the most difficult thing Sarah had ever tried to do. How could she forgive herself for taking her family for granted? How could she make peace with the choices that had cost her so much? Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw the same woman. The one who had made all those mistakes, the one who had failed the people she loved. And yet, somewhere deep inside, she also saw someone who was trying to make things right, someone who was willing to confront the past in order to heal. The process was slow, often painful, and full of setbacks. But Sarah began to understand that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It was about accepting it, owning it, and learning from it. She began to make peace with the fact that she couldn't change the years she had lost, but she could control what happened next. And for the first time in a long time, she began to believe that there was hope for the future, that she could build a new life, one rooted in the lessons of her past. It was hard, exhausting work, but Sarah was determined to keep moving forward. She wasn't sure if she would ever fully forgive herself, but she knew that trying was the first step toward healing. And that, she realized, was the most important thing of all. It had been almost a year since Sarah had decided to embark on the difficult journey of self-forgiveness. That first year had been a mix of painful realizations, hard conversations, and moments of breakthrough. She had been determined to make amends with the people she loved, her children, her late husband's memory, and most of all, herself. But she still found herself struggling with the weight of the past, especially on the days when old regrets resurfaced with the force of a tidal wave, threatening to pull her under once again. One particularly rainy afternoon, Sarah found herself sitting by the window in her living room, a cup of tea in her hands, watching the world outside blur beneath the heavy downpour. It had been a long day of phone calls and video chats with her children. They were doing well, or so they said, and Sarah was grateful for that. Yet, despite the occasional laugh shared with Michael or the heartfelt talks with Emily, there was still a lingering distance between them. It was nothing overt, nothing that could be called anger. But there was a space that couldn't be filled with words alone. Time, as much as Sarah wanted to deny it, had created a gap, a silent barrier that her apologies could not immediately bridge. And that hurt more than she had expected. The hardest part, Sarah realized, was coming to terms with the fact that healing was not a quick fix. It was a slow, almost imperceptible transformation that happened in increments, like the seasons changing 1 degree at a time until the world around her felt slightly warmer, slightly brighter. She had hoped for more. She had hoped for an immediate reconciliation, a clean slate, but the reality of it all was much more complex. There were no shortcuts to healing. As she sat there, her thoughts drifting, Sarah remembered a conversation she had with Dr. Elizabeth a few months prior. They had discussed the need for Sarah to stop chasing perfection, to stop holding herself to impossible standards. Forgiveness isn't about undoing the mistakes, Dr. Elizabeth had said. It's about acknowledging the humanity of those mistakes and recognizing that you, too, are human. The burden you carry isn't because of what you did. It's because of how you view yourself. You've been punishing yourself, Sarah, and you've been doing it for far too long. Sarah had listened to those words over and over in her mind. In many ways, they had reshaped how she viewed herself. For most of her life, she had been a woman defined by her achievements, by the results she could point to and the success she could claim. But now, she was beginning to understand that the truest measure of a life well lived wasn't how much one could accumulate, how many goals one could reach, or how many accolades one could gather. The truest measure was the quality of relationships and the capacity for self-compassion. It was in this moment of reflection, as the rain beat against the window, that Sarah realized how far she had come. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into Dr. Elizabeth's office all those months ago. She was different now. Though the transformation had been subtle, almost imperceptible, she had stopped chasing perfection and had started to make peace with her imperfections. The changes in her relationship with her children were perhaps the most visible indicators of this new path. While the walls of distance had not entirely disappeared, there was a new understanding between them. They weren't always the easy, carefree interaction Sarah had once imagined, but there was more honesty now. She had learned to listen without interrupting, to offer support without imposing, to love without expectations. Emily had started calling her more often, and though their conversations still felt somewhat cautious, there was a tenderness there that hadn't existed before. Michael, too, seemed more open, more willing to share his thoughts and feelings. Their relationships were still works in progress, but they were no longer defined by the silence and regret of the past. What truly surprised Sarah, however, was how much her own sense of self had transformed. She had once believed that she was defined by what she had accomplished, by her career, her success in the legal field, the recognition she had earned. But as the months passed, she began to realize that these things didn't define her at all. What mattered was her ability to love, to learn from her mistakes, to be present for the people who mattered most, and, most importantly, to show up for herself. The woman she had been in her younger years was still there, but she was no longer the same. The Sarah who had chased ambition at the expense of everything else was evolving into someone more grounded, more compassionate, and more aware of the fleeting nature of time. That was perhaps the greatest gift of the past year, the gift of presence. She had learned to be present in ways she had never been before, and she had started to savor the small moments. The quiet mornings with a cup of coffee, the evening walks with her children when they would call just to chat, the peaceful moments of solitude when she could sit and reflect. These moments, once dismissed as insignificant, had become the pillars of her healing. And yet, despite all this progress, Sarah knew there was still work to be done. She couldn't deny the truth that her past choices still haunted her. The guilt didn't simply vanish, and the sense of regret occasionally resurfaced. There were days when the weight of her mistakes pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. On those days, she would find herself sitting in her favorite chair in the garden, the rain softly tapping against the leaves, and she would remind herself of everything she had learned. She reminded herself that forgiveness was not a one-time event, but a practice. And sometimes, practicing forgiveness meant allowing herself the grace to feel the pain, but not to let it consume her. It wasn't until one particular evening, after yet another conversation with Michael, that Sarah truly understood the full scope of what she had achieved. It had been a simple conversation. Michael had called to talk about his new job and the challenges he was facing. They talked about his career, his family, and the weather, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt like a mother again. Not in the way she had once imagined, with all the perfect answers and advice, but simply in the way of being there, listening, offering support, and just being a sounding board. It was so simple, yet so profound. After they hung up, Sarah sat back in her chair and thought about the path she had traveled. She had started this journey weighed down by guilt, regret, and the belief that she had missed her chance for true connection. But now she saw things differently. The process of healing had been slow and painful, but it had been necessary. She had forgiven herself, not because her children had forgiven her, or because David's memory had absolved her, but because she had learned to recognize the humanity in her mistakes. And by doing so, she had learned to see herself as a woman capable of growth, of change, and of redemption. The following morning, Sarah found herself walking through the garden again, as she had done so many times before. But today felt different. Today, the roses seemed to bloom a little brighter, the air seemed a little fresher, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt a quiet peace settling within her. She had done the work. She had faced her regrets, confronted her past, and allowed herself to evolve. And though the journey wasn't complete, she was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. Sarah smiled as she looked out at the garden, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly present in the moment. The weight of her past no longer consumed her, and the uncertainty of the future no longer paralyzed her. She had learned that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It was about accepting it and finding a way to live with it. And in that acceptance, she had found her way back to herself. The journey wasn't over, and perhaps it never would be. But for Sarah, that was the point. The road to self-forgiveness wasn't about reaching some final destination. It was about the continual act of showing up, both for herself and for the people she loved. And in that, she had already found the transformation she had been searching for all along.